back to Homiletics. Last time we discussed how to prepare the introduction, and today we're going to cover the conclusion. Again, the reason we wait to the end of sermon preparation to do the conclusion is just like the reason we wait to the end to prepare the introduction. Now we know what to conclude. And so let's talk about concluding the sermon. And let's answer this question. Why do preachers not conclude very well? I think this is one of the difficulties in my sermons, one of the weaknesses in my sermons. And I think Jerry Vines and Jim Shattuck here provide some reasons for us. Sometimes the preacher may run out of preparation time, causing him to tack on a thoughtless summary of the message. That can be one reason. Another reason is preachers are faced with limitation of time, like time constraints, such as preaching on the radio, preaching on the television, or 12 o'clock Sunday morning, when a lot of people expect the sermon to be done. So we don't gauge our time, we don't pace our sermon, and we get up against that time crunch, and we sacrifice the conclusion. Still, other preachers neglect foundational work on the sermon, like unifying the theme or logically developing the main assertions or the main divisions. We don't know what to conclude exactly. Maybe the MPS, main point of the sermon, is not clear. And so we cannot conclude well, at least specifically. G. Campbell Morgan, I mentioned him last time, was a great expositor. You remember he would read a book in the Bible 50 times before he would begin to preach from it. But he said this in his instructions on preaching: every conclusion must conclude, include, preclude. I like those three thoughts. Conclude means to conclude the message, not just stop preaching. There is a difference. Again, sometimes you run out of time and you say, well, I'm just going to stop on verse 3 and we'll pick this up next time. That's ending the sermon, but it's not concluding the sermon. And then to include means to repeat what was previously said, especially the main point of the sermon and then the main divisions, but not re-preaching the sermon in the conclusion. Sometimes we need not to just repeat, but restate. Say those main divisions, tweak those main divisions a little bit. And then to preclude or prevent means prevent the MPS from being neglected. So what we're going to see is in the conclusion, we want two parts. We want to summarize. That's what we're talking about right here. But we also want to exhort. We want to exhort one last time our listeners to do the main point of the sermon. Jay Adams has some a helpful, concrete example here. He says some preachers, in concluding their sermon, it's like trying to land a plane. They're just a few feet from the wheels touching the ground, but then they have another thought. They zoom up into the air again. They circle back and they're about to land. They lower the flaps. They start to come in for the landing, and then they shoot back up again into the sky because they had another thought. And so we have to discipline ourselves not to bring in additional thoughts in the conclusion. We are concluding. We're not continuing to preach. Haddon Robinson says also that our conclusion must not resemble a crash. We want it to be the final touch on that sermon. In the conclusion, you do not answer any more questions. So that's where we don't want to get another thought or continue to preach in the conclusion. In the conclusion, we're not answering any more questions because we've answered the questions with those 4 rhetorical processes under each main division. Explanation has answered this question. What does the passage mean? Our listeners are asking that question when we read the verses in that main division. Then the second question asked is, hopefully, how do you know that's the meaning? We want our people to be like the Bereans who search the scriptures to see if what they have been told is true. And so we want to get into their thinking and support the explanation with other material. This is where we do the cross-referencing. This is where we bring in the systematic theology. We support the meaning of the explanation. Illustration, we're answering their question. What does this truth look like? Give me a concrete example. Give me a word picture of what you've been explaining. And then the application is where they're sitting there saying, what does this have to do with my life? Haddon Robinson says this question is, so what? How's this going to help me in my Christian life as a husband, a wife, a parent, an employee, a friend? This is where we apply the sermon. In the conclusion, we do not introduce new material. We exhort our listeners to respond to the main point of the sermon. Jerry Vines says it's like a lawyer bringing his closing arguments to the jurors. He brings it all to the focus, and then he invites them to respond. So that's a good way. That's another good concrete example. Conclude and exhort to respond to the MPS, main point of the sermon, with, and here's some examples of how we can conclude with a series of exhortations. I like this one right here because it's the most specific. Write down 5 names of unsaved people you plan to pray for. You preach on praying for the unsaved. And here's your conclusion. This is concrete. This is something they can do. This is a specific response. So in the conclusion, in getting them to respond to the main point of the sermon, we could do a series of exhortations. We could do a series of questions that are affirmative. And again, I like this one from Haddon Robinson. An appropriate question or even a series of questions can conclude a sermon effectively. A sermon on the Good Samaritan ended, let me conclude where I began. Do you love God? That's splendid. I'm glad to hear that. Here's the second question. Do you love your neighbor? How can we talk about loving God whom we have not seen if we do not love our brothers and sisters and our neighbors whom we have seen? If you do love your neighbor, do you mind if I ask them? That is a powerful series of questions. That's a very convicting series of questions. And so in my sermon on Elijah, why do Christian leaders suffer depression and what is the cure? I asked these questions, and each one of the questions was my main division. I just converted my main division into a question. Are you depressed today because of physical exhaustion? Elijah was. Are you depressed today because of a wrong view of success? Elijah was. That was my second main division. Are you depressed today because you are lonely? Elijah was. That was my third main division. There is a way of asking questions in the conclusion. A story that captures your main point of the sermon and also the main point and also the main divisions. You probably want to abbreviate this story. I give you this example right here. This is a sermon that I preached on. You can fail and not be a failure. It's based on Mark, who failed but was not a failure. So in the introduction, this is a lengthier introduction than I normally give, but it's about Daniel Rudiger, or Rudy. Perhaps you've seen the movie. But I also got additional material on Rudy from John Maxwell's book, Failing Forward. just a lot of good material. And then also Rudy himself wrote a book. So I'm not going to go through this. Perhaps you know the story, but this is an incredible story of a guy who made D's in school. He wanted to go to Notre Dame and play football, and everybody thought that's the most ridiculous idea in the world. Number one, you don't have the grades. Number one, you don't have the physical capacity to do that. But he overcame all of that. He went to the Navy. He came back. He went to a junior college, a community college in connection with Notre Dame. He made straight A's. He got into Notre Dame. He had 2 years of football eligibility left. He was a scrub, but he was the best scrub. He made sixth string, and in the very last game, you remember, they put him in. The team demanded that the coach put Rudy in because he had paid his dues in practice as a scrub, and he sacked the quarterback. And Notre Dame football team did something that had never been done in the history of Notre Dame football. They carried Rudy off the field. What a story. And so I use that as the introduction to preach on John Mark. And this is a sort of a different approach. I'm preaching a narrative sermon, basically, or a biography sermon. And what I do, I just look at every reference to John Mark in the New Testament. I begin with the first one, and I end with the last one. And I just tell his story by going by these verses. And then I conclude, or after that, I bring two principles from the life of John Mark. Number one, our sins and failures can be costly. Well, we know what it cost John Mark. Paul would not allow him to go on the next missionary trip. But here's the second principle. And then under that, under number one, you can do your argument, you can do your explanation, argumentation, but you've done that probably up here. But here, you're probably just going to emphasize the illustration and application. You see that? This is one of those unique ways to add variety to your preaching. And then the second principle was our sins and failures can be invaluable if we learn from them. John Mark learned from them. So can those who are hearing us. And so did Rudy. And then in the conclusion, I finished the Rudy story because he became a motivational speaker after his college days. And he petitioned Hollywood to produce a movie based on his life, which took him 6 years, 2 years longer than it took him to get into Notre Dame. The people in Hollywood told him, "You're not a Paul Hornung or Joe Montana." Rudy agreed. "There's only one of them," he explained. "There's a million of me." What a story. What a message of encouragement. You can fail, but not be a failure. And so that this is a unique way. I like this. I haven't done this very often. But your introduction, your conclusion are about the same person. And so it's like you tell the rest of the story of Rudy in the conclusion. So that's just to add some variety to your preaching. The importance of a purpose statement in your conclusion. In the conclusion, remember, we summarize, but we also exhort them to do or respond to the one purpose, which is the main point of the sermon. And so I give this example from A.W. Dale, who was a very noted preacher. Every Saturday night, he would preach his sermon to his wife. And then at the end of one of those practiced sermons, she said, "Tell me, why are you preaching this sermon?" A purpose statement is why you're preaching this sermon. In the conclusion, write a purpose statement. What is the one specific result you want to see because of you're preaching the main point of the sermon? Let's say you preach on spiritual gifts. So in the conclusion, maybe the main point of your sermon is you must know what your spiritual gift is. But in the conclusion, you could challenge your listeners to determine what is your spiritual gift. What is it? Can you tell me what your spiritual gift, since I have covered the operative spiritual gifts for today? Perhaps you preach again on praying for the unsaved. And then in your conclusion, your purpose statement is you want them to resolve to pray every day for 2 weeks for an unsaved person, or maybe for 5 unsaved persons. You're asking them for a specific response. And so you can look at those examples there of specific purpose statements. In the conclusion, the preacher not only summarizes the main point of the sermon and the main divisions, but he exhorts his listeners to be doers of the word and not hearers only. So that conclusion should have 2 parts. Summary, number 1, summary. Number 2, exhortation. Tony Merida said, so the conclusion has 2 important parts, a summation and a response. So let me just wrap it up with this. After the conclusion of the sermon, you should transition to the invitation. Now I know there's all kinds of ideas on invitations, but there still needs to be a transition to the invitation. Whether you give a public invitation or not, there has to be some kind of invitation for your people to respond. If it's to go to a room and we'll meet you there, or if it's to come to the front of the service, or if it's to contact me this week or after the service, there needs to be some kind of invitation to respond. And there needs to be a transition from the conclusion to the invitation. And this was just drilled into my thinking one time. Our school used to have an ensemble that would go out and sing, and one of the preacher boys would go with them and preach. I invited them to come to our church. They sang, he preached. But at the end of the sermon, he finished his conclusion, and he just stood there and looked at the congregation. My minister of music, thankfully, got up, walked up to the front of the church, and basically gave the invitation and concluded the sermon. He had been taught how to prepare the sermon, finished with a conclusion, but he had not been taught how to transition from the conclusion to the invitation. So you could perhaps say something like this: let us stand to our feet as the musicians come. Please respond as we sing. If you need to trust Christ, we will meet you and show you how to be saved. If you need someone to pray with you, we will pray with you. If you need to simply come and kneel and pray, please come and as we sing. The conclusion is really not technically the last part of the sermon. You are exhorting them to respond, and then you are giving them the opportunity to respond. So I hope these thoughts on the conclusion will help you in your sermon preparation.